Welcome back to another live stream with Professor Steve Queen. Steve Queen is going to be answering questions today. Dave's back in the house. It's going to be really exciting. I'm going to make him answer questions too. I do have some questions for you. So I made a community post on Steve's YouTube channel, and we're kind of figuring out what we want to do with this show. I've posted a bunch of little questionnaires. I made a questionnaire. I'm going to do more of those now. They're really fun to do. And it's just asking, should we have guests? Should we do more Q&A shows? Et cetera, et cetera. One of the options, too, is actually changing the day. There's a number of reasons why we would change the day. For one, actually, a lot of people like weekdays better. Two, Steve releases his weekly videos on Sundays. We don't want the algorithm to interfere with that. They are really good videos, hundreds of thousands of views. Huge, as Donald Trump would say. So that's kind of like one of the questions too. And also just any general input you want to put in there. We'll take a look at it, and we'll try to come up with some ideas to make sure this stream is viewed as possible. And we'll go from there. I'm going to bring on Dave first because we haven't seen him. Let's see. There's Dave.
Hello. Why, hello.
Hey.
It's like I never left. You know Godfather 3? It's like, just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in.
Yeah.
It's like that, except I asked to be back on, so that kind of ruins that idea.
Well, you were always going to come back on. I just didn't know what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. Now, one of the ideas I have, so Dave's a much better host than I am, is if we had guests.
Be modest.
If we had guests, Dave would host the guest shows. If we're doing Q&As, I would host the Q&A shows, and there would be no rules, right? 1 week we could have a guest, maybe the next week we don't, and that's just to make the workload easier on me. Because
we tried rules, they didn't really work.
Yeah, protocols.
Yeah,
wasn't a great thing.
It wasn't a strong point. No,
it wasn't.
We just rolled with whatever in the end.
So, Dave, you gotta update us. It's been January.
Yeah.
So it's half a year later. Your life's changed. I don't notice any more gray hair. I do notice more gray hair on me. I don't know what's happening there.
It's probably lighting. I haven't dyed it, not yet anyway. But I'm getting to the age where the beard needs some dye, maybe.
I'm getting
some pepper.
Yeah.
So that's happened. There probably is some grey hairs in there. I've had it's roasting over here. I'm sure if you're listening in the US on the East Coast, it's probably roasting as well, and it's I'm loving it. I've got most people probably don't know, but I have a sort of side hustle as a triathlete, which I'll try to keep up with, and I've got it's basically I go to age group Olympics. So Olympics for old gits, right? So I'm going to the World Champs in October. So I'm getting fit for that. I've got a coach and everything. So this morning I was out in the lake swimming. It was absolutely gorgeous. And then I was talking about it with Steve, and he's like, yeah, well, that'll be great until the agriculture fails. So he's always going to bring it down, doesn't he? Just when you're really enjoying the summer heat, you get reminded by Steve that it's global warming happening.
It's a dynamic system, right? So
system,
your feelings are being reinforced by some good, hot, warm weather. But as a system as a whole, there are balancing feedback loops that are going to come and balance that system of happiness back into mediocrity.
Or misery.
Or misery, right?
So yeah. I know. No, it was great. This is why I haven't been on the shows. It's just like, just when I think I'm feeling okay, I get reminded that we live in a complex system which we're fucking up completely. So it's great to be back.
Perfect. Let's bring on the man, not Steve Queen, but Steve Keen. Here he is.
Hey.
Yeah, that was a pretty wild introduction there, mate. Actually, I used to get mistaken all the time for Steve King because there was a very good friend of mine, Helen King, who ran the education office for the Australians refugee organisation called AustCare, Australians Care for Refugees. And without fail, when I go, particularly when we go together to a radio show somewhere, when you're Mr. and Mrs. King. Well, we had a little bit of fun at various times in our relationship, but mainly a platonic relationship. But yeah, I get introduced as King, but this is the first time I've been introduced as Mr. Queen.
You could have got away with being the horror writer, and but never mind.
Yeah, I don't do with his income, that's for sure.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
So everybody make sure you roll your questions into the chat. I should have said that right off the bat so we'd have a bunch of them. First question, of course, is from Tony, and it's directed at Dave.
Yeah, I see that.
What's it like living in a third world country? 'Cause the news on Britain isn't that good. I saw today more calls for Rachel Reeves to be dumped and even Stamer to come back and be dumped. What's going on in the UK?
I think what we've ended up with is and I can't speak for everyone, but for me, there's a kind of closing of the eyes about British politics, because it still feels very much like, unless you're a diehard Labour voter and you'd vote for them no matter what, it just feels like carrying on with another label, because mainly because of Reeves. So, and yet there's at least on the surface, there's these things like the nationalising of British Rail, which seems obvious when you use the rail. You realise the private version of it's not working. So that seems like a good thing. I don't know how long it's going to take to come in. So it seems like there's some things happening, but I don't. The third world thing is, I know it's easy to rag Britain. It's just like there seems to be so many own goals that Britain has scored in the last couple of decades. But yeah, at the same time, I'm quite impressed with the. I don't know. It still feels like a good community here, no matter what. People are very correctly, when they're critical of what is going on in this country, they don't miss the mark. They know what's wrong. And so I think that's to Britain's credit. But yeah, I mean, it's frustrating for people like, me, and I, when I hear Steve commenting on it, and I listen to Steve with Phil Dobby, and Phil, you can just feel his frustration with what's going on. It's very easy to diagnose. It's very hard to find the critical voices reaching the people that need to hear it. I think that's what's frustrating. But that's kind of where we're at. Is it better? I don't know. I feel like we're in some sort of interregnum between the Tories, and I think what'll happen is there will be some shitstorm of sorts. I don't know what it'll be, but a massive crisis in which the Labour government that exists will have to shed its skin, and there will be probably a form of some form of perhaps old Labour come through it all. I don't know. But
to me, I mean, just as somebody who's lived there for a while, and I was back there last week, I'm derived from English stock, fortunately diluted by Irish and French and Scottish. It just feels like it's turning into a third world country to me over time. It's still, I mean, this is what I find so frustrating about London. It's still got the best people for having great political discussions. My best friends, in terms of the people that I socialize with and work with over there, I miss having regular conversations with them. We used to have Richard O'Rourke. You would have seen Richard getting involved with Ravel recently. Richard used to organise a brunch where a whole bunch of nerds on energy would turn up and have brunch and discuss energy and economics issues. Positive Money, the people in that group were part of my circle, and Pettifor, David Graeber when he was live, Nika Dabrowski now, though she's living all over the place at the moment. It was a good community. Josh Ryan Collins, and not only I've had good conversations with him, I'd play tennis with him as well. It was marvelous in that sense. So that side of England is still a strength that I think. I certainly didn't find it in Sydney, and I don't think it exists in New York anywhere near as much as it does in London. That sense of a progressive community having intelligent conversations. Meanwhile, you've got the worst fucking Conservative government on the planet. And then that's what's so frustrating, because the obsession with eliminating the government deficit has been there for 40 or 50 years. The obsession with privatisation has gone further in the UK than any comparable certainly Anglo-Saxon country. America was, coming from the other side of that, and we'll never get there. But you can see the damage that it's done, particularly if you're old enough to have experienced, enough of the previous civilization. So one of my wishes, if I could get one magic wish fulfilled, it would bring Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher back and put them on trains and not tell them which country they're in, and try them to work out which country they're in. So I'm pretty certain I'll dump them both. You do it, double experiences: European trains and English trains, and then ask them which country they think they're in. And they would think, the fancy, fast, technologically developed, comfortable trains, that must be England, privatized rail. And the relics, literally including trains which you have to put your hand through the window to open the door in some lines in UK, that must be socialized Europe, obviously. No privatization. This is what government centralized control breeds you. Then say, sorry, guys, you're 100% wrong. The primitive, undeveloped basket case museum piece trains are England, and the fancy ones, and which are privatized, and the English are the European, the fast, efficient, cheap, comfortable trains. They're publicly owned in Europe. And get this, kids. Most of the private lines in England are owned by companies, national companies in Europe. So they're really screwing you over, and then send them back to what? Well, it'd be hell, but that'd be the new hell loop anyway.
I'm fascinated by because mixed economies have been arguably, I think completely the most successful. I mean, even the US is a mixed economy, right? Not everything
they're all mixed economies. Yeah. By the way, right? James used comment there. Make sure I get a chance to reply to that one later. Yeah.
Is where, take Britain. There's kind of been this argy-bargy for decades now over which things ought to be state provided and which things not. And I never find anyone able to put their finger on what's a good litmus test. I mean, it's not obvious.
There is a good litmus test.
Oh, good.
And there's actually a book on it, written by a friend of mine, Avner Offer, Avner, Offer, surname, and it's called The Public-Private Divide. It doesn't go as far as I'd like it to, but what Avner argues is the basic dividing line between something which should be private and what should be public is the length of time it takes to get a payback, because the longer it does take to get a payback to maintain as well as to build a system, the more likely it is that the sheer financial costs of the private sector that has to face, where it's either got to borrow money or it's got to pay dividends or implicitly give away equity to lose money until such time as that facility exists, and then it's got to do maintenance for long term rather than just short term issues. Those situations, you're better off public owned, okay? And that's obviously things like sewerage. Okay?
Sewage, we were just talking about before we came on, and rail.
Yeah, rail and then education as well. I mean, the worst. I mean, I'm so sick of this because I've lived it for 50 years, and certainly for 30 years while I was an academic. The idea that students should pay for their education means that they treat it like a commodity, where they've gone into a supermarket, they've paid their money. You give me those fucking strawberries, or I'll call the police. Okay, that's the attitude that develops in students when they've paid for their education. And equally, to try to encourage the students inside your door, because you've now got universities competing as private enterprises against each other, the universities dumb down the standards to make sure the students going to get the degree. So one of the things that really pissed me off at Kingston, but it's just common throughout what they call the post-92 universities in the UK, is that we had a requirement to give 92% of students in third year a first-class honours result. We were criticised if we didn't give 92% first-class honours. That is a joke. Okay? And it's partly the English system's always been based on great inflation, but that just got to be beyond the pale. I'd rather be able to fail students. make it free, and if they do a bad exam, they fail, have to repeat the year. That's what we need. And, so I'm a strong critic of commercialization of education because it's literally changed the product. It's gone from being learning to becoming credentialism. So there's a whole range of industries where that makes sense. Politics, it shouldn't be the case that political parties have to fund themselves by raising money, because then you get the best politicians that money can buy. So there's a very good dividing line, and the longer it takes to get a return, or the more public benefit you get out of something rather than private. We all benefit from having educated population. Look at the shit we're in now by not having it. Welcome to Twitter, the sewerage of Twitter. We desperately need to have that dividing line.
So we'll move on to the next question. Good morning, Ty, Steve, and Dave. I'm considering modeling an AI. It may eat capitalism and ravel. Would a Cobb-Douglas be the backbone? No, Douglas. I know it's in your name, but if you want a production function where you can swap out a necessary input like oil with tennis shoes, you could use the Cobb-Douglas function. But I would suggest you actually look up the Leontief production function, Leontief production function. And I think this is kind of a good segue for Steve to actually kind of break down a little bit of the history with production functions, specifically those two, and kind of explain how they're derived in economics and how they're used.
Yeah, okay, this is thanks, Ty. This was a complete surprise, but not an unexpected one, because one thing I've specialized in, and it's one of I'm becoming a cranky old man the older I get, is reading neoclassical papers in the original. So not just saying, what does the textbook say? I say, what did the person who wrote the journal paper on which the textbook is based say? So the Cobb-Douglas production function, for those that don't know it, says that output is the product of a technology factor, which they normally use the capital letter A for, and that varies over time, multiplied by a labor factor and a capital factor. Labor and capital are supposed to represent units of those two productive forces. Of course, defining units of labor is easy. It's workers and it's how many hours they work per year. Capital is much, much harder because there is no such thing as a uniform piece of capital, and that was part of what's called the capital controversies that neoclassicals completely ignored the results of, in which they lost. But anyway, so it's A times K times L, where K and L are both raised to a power that represents the fraction of national income that goes to those two so-called factors of production. So initially, when Cobb-Douglas first did this, and they said they fitted it empirically, they had labor being raised to the power of 0.75 because labor got about 3/4 of national income, and capital raised to the power of 0.25 because capital got about 25% of national income. And they claim to derive it from a set of index numbers that the economist in the group, who's I've got to remember which one was Cobb. Cobb put the numbers together, and he took them to the mathematician. Hang on, that's right. And I think Douglas is the economist and Cobb is the mathematician. So Douglas took his numbers to Cobb and said, what sort of function can fit this? Now, this is a detailed history, so brace yourselves. They fitted it to a constant, which they used the letter B for, times L to the alpha and K to the 1 minus alpha. And they then they did a regression analysis on it, on the data, which, of course, their index for production was rising most of the time. Their index for labor was rising most of the time, and digital capital most of the time. And when one turned down, so did the other. So I think the expression that statisticians use is collinear. One's positive, the other's positive. One's negative, the other's. One's going up, the other's going. They're all going up or down at the same time. And they got a correlation coefficient for their equation of 0.97. Okay, now that is largely due, and Samuelson said this when he looked at their results. This is because they're collinear. If three numbers are always rising or falling, and you have Y as one of them, and K as the other, and L's the third, if they're always going up and always going down at the same time, you're going to get virtually 100% correlation. But they then said, this is true, but we've also looked at the detrended data, and the detrended data has a correlation coefficient of 0.94. So that just wins the argument, Well, I had a look, and what they did to so-called detrend the data is they took a 3-year moving average of the data and subtracted the numbers, both the actual and the model data numbers, from that 3-year moving average, where they used the coefficients they derived in the growing trend to provide the coefficients for the for the coefficients for the exponents. Now, the thing is, the deviations from the moving average were much the same as the deviations in the actual data. So it gave you a high correlation for the same reasons you got it out of the raw data. But if you do the log differentiation, which is the standard way you convert a series into a rate of change, the coefficient for the labor is not 0.75, it's minus 0.11. Okay. Now that just throws neoclassical theory out the window, because as Robert Solow later said, if Cobb-Douglas had not reported coefficients of 0.75 for labour and 0.25 for capital, we would not now be talking about aggregate production functions. In other words, the whole area wouldn't have developed. If Cobb-Douglas had done the mathematics correctly, they wouldn't have published the fucking paper. Now, the reason the neoclassical stuck with it, it confirms their theory of income distribution. So they've stuck with it that way. And this is the final point. I'm going to see Ty's getting edgy here. The reason that they haven't discovered them themselves is that in the original equation, there was no term for technology. And when you think about it properly, technology is embodied in the machinery itself. Okay? The workers generally can be retrained for any machine. The technology is in the machine. There's no point to separate the two out. But when you did do that, he said we have to assume the coefficients, the exponents for labour and capital, just take them from neoclassical growth theory, the neoclassical distribution theory. They're the marginal product of labour and capital, respectively. So they've never even seen how fucked up their own statistics were. There's no way you should use the Cobb-Douglas production function. And that's without getting into the Leontief function yet. Back to you, Ty. Do I keep on going?
No, we'll keep rolling. There you go, Douglas. Don't use the Cobb-Douglas. I know it's in your name. I know it's tempting, but just don't do it. Like you said, you can't power your machine with tennis shoes. We've got a good question here. Hi, I am a 17-year-old guy. I don't know if you're a guy yet, but you're getting there. And I want to have a successful career as an economist. Can you give me a roadmap? Or how did you do it? And if you could do it all again, yada, 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 I'm going to college next year. Steve, I know you've got some insights here. Start spitting them.
Oh, Jesus. Okay, well, for starters, I hope it looks like you're in India. And I hope you are, because for Christ's sake, I wouldn't go to a Western university anymore. I'd go to some of the universities in Europe because they still have free tuition there. So if you get into a university in Europe, they tend to be well funded. You can't buy your degree like you can in America or the UK or Australia. So you get better quality education where you don't have to pay for the education. That might sound ironic to market Austrians and that sort of thing, but that makes sense. So go to a university in India or China, or maybe Europe. Don't even think about one in America or the UK or Australia. First thing. Secondly, knowing what I know about economics these days, I'd say don't study economics. Do a maths degree or do an engineering degree and apply the skills you learn there to economic issues, because what you'll get in virtually every economics department on the planet is they're dominated by neoclassicals. They'll give you the neoclassical canon, and you might as well be learning Ptolemaic epicycles and phlogiston and don't even look at Austrian economics, but have a good laugh, because they're equally non-scientific. They've got their own fantasy they call praxeology, which means they don't do empirical research and they stick with a bunch of crazy theories. So my advice would be, first of all, think more about engineering and mathematics or system dynamics, if that's offered at the universities you're at. Maintain an interest in economics, but don't study an economics degree. If you want to learn the actual economics, get a copy of my Debunking Economics, which will give you a much more honest coverage of how the theory is developed than anything you'll get out of a neoclassical textbook. And then apply the skills you learn in system dynamics and mathematics or engineering to economic issues will do much better.
Steve being the catcher in the rye of young economists.
Dave, why aren't you an economist? Why didn't you become an economist, Dave?
I thought one of my saving graces is that I have the advantage of not being an economist. I thought the whole thing was to. I think we've always struggled with not academics per se, because you want the expertise, but I've always struggled with finding people that like to connect the dots between big issues. And what happens with economists is they still specialize way too much for me. So I guess I've ended up being too much of a generalist, probably, to be a good economist. I like the big picture stuff, but I'm definitely not details enough. My maths is terrible, but I enjoy talking to people who are close to this stuff, like you and Steve, because you do understand it at a deep level, but you're able to talk about it kind of at my level, or you would tolerate me asking the dumb questions, which is what I love. So yeah, I don't think I'd ever turn the clock back and go, oh, become an economist or anything like it. It was never in my my signs in the runes for me, anyway.
Yeah, I'm precisely the reason why I am not well versed on academic economics is why I like economics.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's hard to grasp or not, but I managed to kind of sidestep all the traditional economic views for the most part. I did my deep dive some years ago, but boy, it can make economics dry if you go that route with comparative advantage and supply and demand graphs. And none of it's real. Absolutely.
And a lot of it ends up being debunked by by people like you when you actually pull it apart and you go, well, these are models that are just in people's heads.
Yeah, exactly.
Mental
which is
models.
depressing, because people spend their lives studying this stuff and encouraging other young people like the chap you were just talking to, Steve, to study this stuff, and it's not real.
It's a fantasy. I mean, I've got harder and harder on my attitude towards them over time, because, I started critiquing them when I was 18 years old. Now I'm 72, and the state of economics is worse than it was when I was an 18-year-old in terms of how extremely disconnected it is from the real world. And if you go back and look at the various points where it should have broken down, the very first one occurred in the 1910s when the Perron-Frobenius theorem was derived by pure mathematicians. And as it happens, totally this is collateral damage. When you apply that mathematical theorem about the dominant eigenvalue of a positive semi-definite matrix, for those who need to know, it undermines Walras' idea of general equilibrium. That's right. Most economists have no idea what I'm talking about there, let alone most non-mathematicians. But yeah, it just says that what Walras thought was a stable process to converge to an equilibrium price vector in a production economy does not work. Okay, and it doesn't even work in the static models they did for computable general equilibrium. So equilibrium is blither, as Keynes once said, but in fact it's provably blither. And so from that point on, they should have had non-equilibrium pricing. But the reaction of neoclassicals when they discovered this thing, which they didn't discover until 1960, when it was done in the 1910s, was, we have to change our conditions to impose equilibrium on the system. So equilibrium went from being a short-term kludge that Jevons and Marshall certainly knew that, and partially so did I think Walras had a rough idea. Became from being an analytic convenience to be replaced later by proper dynamic methods to a religious belief about the nature of capitalism. And that's not what you get when you do a neoclassical model. You get all these assumptions about how the system reaches equilibrium. And what they're using, and this makes it even more absurd, they're using the Ramsey growth model from 1928. And the Ramsey growth model has an unstable equilibrium. Okay, it's what's known as a saddle. So if you wanted to use a saddle as an analogy for a dynamic system, what happens if you throw a ball bearing onto a saddle? What happens? It slides off. That's what happens. It's unstable. But they then said, well, if you could throw the ball bearing precisely down the nose of the horse, so it goes down and goes on up and down the back and stays exactly on the spine, then you'll fluctuate up and down, and that'll give you cycles. So they assume we can all do that. In other words, we can all
have these sorts of conversations.
What?
They
Huh?
seriously have these sorts of conversations.
They seriously make these sorts of beliefs and don't realize how fucking absurd they are.
What the fuck?
Okay, that is just you look at it and they simply assume that everybody in the world can work out the unstable the angle at which the unstable eigenvector intersects current time, and they can extrapolate forward into the future because we all have perfect foresight. We can all predict the future. Isn't that a wonderful world?
I had that moment so I'd heard you talk about this,
Yeah.
and it's hard to believe that people they're not rigorous somehow, because this is serious stuff. And then we had George Selgin on, who's thoroughly decent guy. I really like George, right? But then towards the end of the conversation about loanable funds, you were talking about these models, and you said, well, it's this it works like this because of X, Y, Z. And he was like, oh, I don't do maths.
I know.
I mean, what? What do you mean? No, I don't either, but I'm not the one that's saying, here's my model.
I know. The funny thing was, he thought I wrote those to impress my followers. Fuck it, I thought I was communicating with them. Then it turns he can't read differential equations. Well, I'm sorry, that's your problem, not mine. But yeah, the extent to which they'll stick to their religion, and this is why it's so important to understand Thomas Kuhn's work on the structure of scientific revolutions, because Kuhn went to research the progression from the mythical models of the Ptolemaic astronomers to the scientific ones of Copernicus, according to the theories of Karl Popper, whom at the time he started doing his thesis, he accepted Popper's paradigm about how science progresses. And what Popper argued was that science works by individuals making what he called bold conjectures. Literally, it sounds like a Star Trek episode. You make a bold conjecture, and then you attempt to refute your conjecture. He said that's what a scientist does. So you make a bold conjecture, you then try to contradict it, and only if it survives contradiction do you carry on with it. But every time you make it, you'll find some way it does fail. So you then modify the theory a bit so that it now covers that. But you always are trying to contradict your own hypotheses. Now that's basically saying that we think all scientists are schizophrenics. Okay? You come up with an idea and you try to destroy it. It's not at all what happens. And this is what Kuhn realized when he started researching how the transition was made from the Earth-centric to the sun-centric vision of the solar system. Because he looked at what the Ptolemaic astronomers are doing and said, they've got a very complicated model to which they're fitting the empirical data. And he called the model a paradigm. So what they had was the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, and the sun and the moon and stars all rotate, and planets all rotate around us, was the original hypothesis from Aristotle. There were rival ones way back in Aristotle's time saying that the Earth rotates around the sun, but that one didn't win the argument. Then Ptolemy, I think in the early zeros to hundreds, Ptolemy said, because with observation, you can see that some of the planets don't circle. There's the planet's reverse direction. Planets is actually apparently the ancient Greek word for wanderer. So these four objects, which we could see with the naked eye, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, those were the only four that could be observed. Mercury was too close. They appeared reverse direction all the time. So what they then said, what Ptolemy said was, there are these perfect concentric spheres, just like Aristotle said, but the four planets are also on spheres that rotate on four of these inner concentric spheres. And that's why they change direction, because sometimes they're going that way and sometimes they're going that way. It's just a circular motion. And it was an incredibly complicated art to fit that paradigm to the data, because there are all sorts. We know it's completely wrong about the planet, the universe. But to make it fit, first of all, they said the center of the universe is not quite the Earth. And they could justify that religiously by saying, well, if the Earth was at the perfect center of the universe, it would be perfect, and it's not. Therefore, it can't be at the center, has to be slightly offset. And then the point of rotation was not where the center was. So all these, they had equants and deference and a huge range of different terms they put together. It was a real challenge to fit the data to that. And so it was, you're using your brain power really impressively. Okay, so you said I can't treat them as mythical. They're really trying hard to fit the data, but of course it's completely wrong. So and how do you then change from that view to a new one? Is that the new view is incommensurable. You go from a vision in which the Earth is the center, and there are these religiously determined spheres sitting out there, the one where the sun is the center, and we are just another planet. There are 4 planets. There are 5. And we are rotating around the sun at the same time. And the apparent fact of the planets reversing direction is sometimes we're seeing them from the same side of the sun, where they're going the same way, and other times we're seeing from the opposite side of the sun, where they're going the opposite way, but we're all just simply rotating around the planet. So that was where the idea of paradigms, the incommensurability of one paradigm with another came from, but also adherence to a paradigm, defend the paradigm.
Absolutely, yeah. The culture is to gather around and stop it from being pulled apart.
Neoclassicals are doing that. They're defending the paradigm. Anything which challenges it, like George trying to cope with the argument that banks create money and trying to undermine it by saying they have to borrow from each other to do that. So bang, I've got you. Was just a typical paradigm defensive attitude, trying to hang on to the argument that banks don't create money, while still admitting that banks create money.
So. Everybody, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you're on X, come over to YouTube. It's a lot more fun to chat here. Let's do another question. We'll get Steve to answer this in 3 minutes or less, not 20 minutes, so we can actually get to some other questions. Hi, Professor Keen. What's your opinion on economic sanctions? What challenges does a sanctioned country like Iran face, and how can it reduce the impact of those sanctions? Loaded question. Steve, go ahead.
Oh, like sanctions can be a very effective way of crippling your economy if you cut off something which is a vital input. And that's what America has tried to do with China, for example, and also Cuba. The thing is, it can backfire, and if you do it with a country like China, because they'll ultimately find a way of replacing what you banned them with. And so you actually end up forcing them to strengthen their own manufacturing sector, and out of that they emerge stronger than you. That's what I think is going on right now. But a country like Iran, I mean, you're a country of 90 million people. That's substantial enough to have significant economies of scale and be able to have your own manufacturing capabilities, design and construction capabilities. So they can sometimes backfire. And I don't know what sanctions America is trying to apply on Iran, but the response to that is to build your own domestic capabilities. Like you're an oil exporting country, obviously, 90 million people. You have the capacity to have a highly educated workforce. You have the capacity to build your own. I know you're also an iron ore exporter. So on that basis, with both petrol and iron in your repertoire, you've got the capacity to build most of what you need for a manufacturing sector. So I would say the sanctions will hurt you in the short term, but could force you to be stronger in the long term.
Steve, he's got a follow-up question. What about hyperinflation? Is there potential for hyperinflation?
Hyperinflation normally happens when another bastard destroys your productive capability and you try to paper it over by just continuing to pump out the government money. That's what the Weimar Republic was actually caused by, because Germany lost the Ruhr and large parts of its productive capabilities after World War I, and they were trying to destroy France was trying to destroy Germany once and for all. If you read Keynes's The Economic Consequences of the Peace, then that was he saw that France was actually trying to destroy Germany in the way that it would work in a feudal system. Okay? He said if you take away the productive resources from a feudal economy, you no longer have the capability to produce that stuff, nothing you can do about it, and you will decline. But he said if you do it to a capitalist economy, it will force them to probably. He pretty much predicted the Weimar inflation. And one intriguing thing I've seen about the Weimar inflation, which was off the scale, truly off the scale when you try to graph it, was that it was actually deliberate. Okay. Now,
that's the story I've heard too.
not
to try and
conscious,
reduce the debt.
in a strange sort of way, because of course they had bonds, they issued bonds. So a lot of the debt was financed by bonds. So the hyperinflation massively devalued the bonds. It caused absolute chaos in Germany itself while it happened, but they just had printing presses running like crazy, and the inflation was tens and hundreds and millions of percent in a year. It only lasted about a year. What it meant was, at the end of it, the bonds that the German government had to pay money on were worthless, and they buy them up for pennies in the pound, and that liberated them from the war debts. So it's partially deliberate, partially accidental, but that may have been a major reason why we got the Weimar inflation. Zimbabwe, it was the decision to hand over the farms from white farmers to the black staff without having the skills to actually take it over. Dramatic drop in production capability. Again, the government, which was led by a madman at the time, Mugabe, was started off sane, but it went crazy under power. And that just destroyed the productive capability of the country, and you had the hyperinflation event there. Venezuela, a similar thing. Argentina, again, massive social inequality. So I had a colleague who wrote a brilliant chapter in a book as a feshrift for Jeff Harcourt about Argentinian and Latin American capitalism versus American. And America at the time, roughly 70% of consumption goods were for workers and 30% for capitalists. In Argentina, it was 70% for capitalists and 30% for workers. The Argentinian capitalists were trying to keep up with their role models in America. So massive inequality, and therefore there's always workers struggling to get pay rises when they can manage them. And you get a feedback cycle that gives you inflation coming out of that. That's that hyperinflation would have come out of the destruction of your productive resources, either by the sanctions or by military action and so on. And you're being forced to put so much of your resources into your military, which is a waste of resources and productive in terms of satisfying people's needs. So all this stuff, that's what would have caused it. And to break out of it, you've got to be self-sufficient to a far, and you've got to have no foreign debt. Certainly no foreign debt denominated in another currency. Those are the traps. They force you to continue, producing exports, not for the export revenue you can then use to invest, but the export revenue then services your foreign debt, and you end up collapsing.
So from David, where can you find system dynamics in Australia? You probably can't. I would suggest you could do a remote program with the University of Bergen, I believe, and WPI, but I don't think they have a remote program. But what I would suggest is you check out System Dynamics or the systemdynamicssociety.org. And they have a lot of individual courses listed there, so you can kind of dig your teeth in, meet the community, find out where there's some programs at different universities. But there's nothing really formalized other than those two institutions I told you about. James, do you not get along with Steve? I've been seeing all your trolley comments here. Basically, your comments are like printing worthless dollars at this point. We'll go on to the next one.
Something intelligent, yeah.
Yes. Here's a good one. What do you think about Richard Warner? What books can you recommend to me about money and the endogenous creation of money, Steve?
That's a brilliant question. Okay, first off, Richard has done excellent work on establishing that banks do create money. This is argued, the neoclassicals argue they don't, without ever doing empirical work. So amongst several things Richard have done, which are of high merit, is he actually went to a small German regional bank and typed in a loan with the agreement of the bank managers, and they were recording all the data, and then saw the actual flows, loans being created, deposit being created, and there was no change in the reserves. Okay, and then the reserves were later had to catch up with the creation of money by the loan. So he's shown the actual micro process of money creation, and that's excellent work, extremely important, and I applaud Richard for that. Which is a prelude to me trashing him now, because on other stuff, and I told him this in his face on Twitter, he didn't like it and I didn't care, that he's a conspiracy theorist. So he has a brilliant understanding of private money creation, but no understanding whatsoever of government money creation. He comes up with the same arguments that the neoclassicals make, that the government's going to run out of money, it's going to go bankrupt, high interest payments, yada, yada, yada. And I tried to get him to use my Ravel software to see that that was bad accounting. And he wouldn't do it. He said, oh, you designed it, so I must have your answers loaded. And I just got exasperated, because what I've designed with Ravel it is not a model. It is a modeling tool. And it enforces double entry bookkeeping. That's how money is created, by double entry bookkeeping, both by governments and by the private sector. And when you model the government structure in Ravel, you see the government is not borrowing money when it sells bonds. It is converting reserves, which are a non-income earning, non-tradable asset for banks, into bonds, which are an income earning, tradable asset for banks. They don't have to do it. And the bonds don't even have to be sold to the private sector. The bonds could all be bought, practically speaking, by the central bank. So there could be no bonds in existence, just reserves for private banks. But they don't do that. And it's basically rewarding the banking sector for maintaining the payment system we have. But you put it together, Richard was giving me the same garbage that I get from a neoclassical, and for somebody like George Selgin, who claims he's not a neoclassical. But yeah, that's conspiracy theory. And he's into chemtrails and a whole lot of other stuff. He believes global warming is a hoax. So I found myself writing a book for the same research group that Richard had written a book for, which is now defunct. It's apparently collapsed, called the Budapest Center for Long-Term Sustainability. And started reading Richard's book because mine was going to be printed in the same format, beautiful format, I might say. That all folded. But I'm reading it, and then he first of all says support for the carbon dioxide hypothesis is at best mixed, quoting one of the well-known deniers, Jane Carter, I think her name was, the main reference he used. And then he finally said that we're going towards a services economy in which the future, like, virtual world economy, free of the constraints of this planet and not subject to the laws of thermodynamics. Well, if I'd paid for the book at that point, I would have thrown it into the nearest garbage bin. But I wrote an extra chapter in my book, which you can find online. I'll copy that into the chat in a moment, where I basically said he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, and his arguments on global warming are nonsense. So I have great respect when he's in his territory, but a bit like some other people I know, when he treads outside it, he's worse than useless.
So we got a super chat of $5 USD from Hank. Hank, thank you.
Okay.
He's got a question as well. How do you model people acquiring money when they don't have assets to trade? How do you model a stock market with outsourcing market data? Steve.
Well, they acquire money. If you don't have assets to trade, you tend to sell your labor. So the way that people get money, in the way that we try and I model the economy using Ravel, workers are by definition people who don't have the means, don't own the means of production. So the only way they can get paid is by working in a factory or in a capitalist firm or a government department, and therefore they acquire money in that sense. Now, you model stock market without sourcing market data. Not quite certain what you mean by that, but for example, part of the conventional theory of markets is that it's called the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis, for those who know their literature. And they argued that private debt played no role in setting the price of non-financial assets, and shares are non-financial assets. Played no role in setting that price because it was quite possible for a highly levered individual to buy a company with no debt, or a company of individual with no leverage at all to buy a highly leveraged company, and therefore there was no impact upon the valuation of the share from the level of debt of the company. And when you do empirical work on that, that is complete and utter bullshit. What you find is, and I made this argument intellectually first and then did the data later, the basic thing with which we buy non-financial assets is borrowed money. Right? Margin debt for shares, mortgages for houses. So the monetary demand for those assets is equivalent to the change in the relevant level of debt. So let's stick with mortgages because they're the one people are most aware of. So the monetary demand for new housing is the change in the level of private mortgage debt. You then divide that by the price index to get how many sort of or uniform representative houses could be bought with that volume of money. So you've now got a relationship between the rate of change of mortgage debt and the level of house prices. You therefore get a relationship between the change in private debt and the change in house prices. And when I do the correlations for the UK, USA, Australia, you get correlation coefficients of the order of 0.7 to 0.8 out of the data. So fundamentally, what's driving change in asset prices is change in the levels of leverage. And that's one reason I'm in favor of abolishing margin debt completely, because when you do it for margin debt, it becomes even more ridiculous. The correlation over 100 years of data with the S&P 500 and more change in margin debt is about 0.8. And that's almost a data series long enough for a physicist to take it seriously, 1,200 data points. And getting a correlation between a second difference and a first difference in economic data of that scale is just ridiculous. So you use the data to calibrate the model in that sense. And the calibration tells us that acceleration of private debt is what drives change in asset market prices, and it's extremely accurate. And Ty's now doing a bit of that work in that direction too, aren't you, mate? What are you doing with your model?
Yes. So we define an S&P 500 in our deep Minsky model, we're calling it. And we had to do a lot of research into what's really driving indexes. So it could be the Dow, the S&P, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found is fundamentally it is what you would think it is. And that's the equity of firms, whether they're non-financial firms, financial firms, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that there is a lag in that ultimately down the line, and there are fluctuations, daily fluctuations that you cannot model. It's impossible. So a random news event, Trump says something stupid again, right? And the markets drop, but they tend to return to their glide path of aggregate firm equity, right? So you can follow that, and if you introduce a lag, it's incredibly accurate. So our findings at this point is that the markets are based on fundamentals ultimately, with fluctuations from daily news that are next to impossible to model in any degreeable way. So that's kind of how we address it. Steve is correct. Credit does drive asset prices, but it's a long kind of causal loop if you look at it from a system dynamic perspective. So credit, it obviously increases the economic activity of firms, so they're going to be investing in their capital stock, produces economic activity, increases their equity down the line. Same with the reverse, if there's a credit crunch in the firm sector or the business sector, that's going to have a negative impact on equity. So that's how we model it with our deep Minsky model. But it's incredibly hard to model the stock market because it is the closest thing to a pure daily auction, where people are making random individual moves. Momentum comes into play, so herd behavior comes into play, and that can be triggered by any news event out there. I wanted to ask Dave, because we kind of covered this earlier, and it's now 10 minutes later. Dave, when you hear the word endogenous money, what comes to mind for you? And I want you to answer from a non-economist viewpoint. What is endogenous money to you?
Sure. So I get confused between whether it's the money that's introduced that didn't exist before, or whether or not it's money that's already in the system. So that's the thing. I don't know if it is that or the opposite of that. So I've heard it lots. Never gone and looked it up. But yeah, that's kind of what I think of it.
Steve, I want you to kind of now elaborate on what endogenous money is, why you may or may not like that term, and give your reasons.
Yeah, well, the fundamental thing is it says that the capitalist system produces money itself. That's what endogenous money means. If you look at the fantasies of Milton Friedman, money is dropped from a helicopter, which means money is created by the central bank. That was his analogy in his optimum quantity of money paper. So according to the neoclassicals, money is an exogenous thing. It's a measuring stick, and it has no impact upon aggregate demand or aggregate income production. It simply changes the price level. That's the neoclassical exogenous money view. When you look in the endogenous money came out of the work of predominantly Basil Moore in the 1970s. So Basil wrote a paper called The Endogenous Money Supply, and in that you'll find the first very simple statement that loans create deposits. But the same stuff can be found in Irving Fisher. You can find it in Joseph Schumpeter as well. It's part of the banking school. It goes back to Thomas Tuch. So there's an enormous history of saying the banking system creates money itself. And that's what endogenous money means. Now, what I don't like about it, it's in terms of, and if you say it to anybody who's not caught up in economics, they're going to go, huh? What the hell does that mean? Endogenous? Even the term requires a certain amount of mathematical knowledge. So the term that I prefer is BOMD, which stands for Bank Originated Money and Debt. And we live in a bombed economy. And I think that's a bit more appealing. And the acronym actually tells you what's going on. So the banks originate money when they originate debt. That's how they create money. And of course, the fiat system goes through the same double entry bookkeeping mechanism, but that's creating money by creating negative equity for the government, which creates the financial sector positive equity for the rest of the economy.
It's Dave. Do you understand now?
No, not enough. But
okay, well, just throw some questions at me. What do you?
Yeah.
Okay, so for neoclassicals, they're thinking there's this fixed amount of money in the system, and this whole concept kind of is where you're throwing new money in, or you're taking money out, or whatever you're doing with your crazy fiat money. That's where I've seen it come up, I think. Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to look at it from that level. I'm trying to think, what are most people thinking endogenous or exogenous money is in that language? And I think that's where I'm getting confused. And also, is it only to do with how banks introduce or don't introduce money into the economy, or is it also referencing what governments do when they legislate new money into existence, as it were?
Yeah, it goes back a long way, because the neoclassicals, right from the get-go, and you can find this in Jean-Baptiste Say in the 1820s, argue that money doesn't matter. Money is just a veil over barter. That's their attitude. And this you can find this in Smith. He says that nobody ever saw a dog make a deliberate trade of a bone with another dog. Is that it's a human propensity to truck and barter. So barter is seen as the basis of capitalism, and money is just a thing that makes barter easier. So what they talk about is money eliminates the double coincidence of wants. So if we're involved in a true barter system, and I've got this nice vaporizer, and you want to buy it off me by giving me mobile phones, and we work out a ratio between mobile phones and vaporizers, and then we do the trade. So there's two commodities, two traders. What we're trying to work out is a relative price. That's their intellectual framework. Now, in the real world, where we live in a monetary economy, there's one thing being sold. I'll take the less obnoxious one. One thing, because I bought one of these. This is brand new. I bought this last week in London. So you have one commodity being purchased, one buyer buying with money, and the purchase is a transfer of the obligations of the bank from the buyer to the seller. And that what it means is when you buy a commodity, the buyer's account goes down, the seller's account goes up. That's the basic story of a monetary economy. Now, what it means, therefore, is that money is a creation of double entry bookkeeping. It's not something backed by gold or any of the other barter-based fantasies that neoclassicals live with all the time and Austrians throw at you and so on and so forth. So the actual process of double entry bookkeeping enables a bank to create money, because a bank is the only institution that's allowed to mark up both its asset side and its liability side, which is when you have deposits. The liabilities of a banking system are fundamentally the deposits of the non-bank sector. So if you get a loan from a building society is not allowed to issue deposit accounts. So what the building society gives you is an account that says you own a fraction of what we've got in our bank account. Okay? So if you then borrow money from a building society to build a house, the amount of money in the building society account goes down, the amount of money in your account goes up, there's no manipulation involved. But if you then go and borrow money from a bank to do the same thing, what the bank does is put a positive amount in your deposit account, and they also record a positive amount in their assets. So their assets go up and the liabilities go up, and their liabilities are the money supply. So creating the money creates additional.
And that's the endogenous money.
That's
the
endogenous money. Simply recognizing, simply recognizing that bank debt is an asset of the banking sector, and money is the liability of the banking sector. So any operation that increases the assets and the liabilities of the banking sector at the same time can create money.
Perfect. Dave, are you a little more in tune now?
Much happier with that. I don't think I was too far off. It was more the fact that that process is what results in endogenous money, and whether or not that is also what is referenced when money is created, when it's legislated into existence for a policy, for example. Whether or not that's the same, do we call that the same thing, or does it only apply to private equity and banks' credit creation?
This is where Ravel's so important, because Ravel's the only program that has double entry bookkeeping tables that show you the interlocking relationships between different entities in a financial system. So when the basic point of both is that to create money, you've got to increase the asset side and the liability or equity side of the banking sector at the same time. Okay, that's the precondition. So, and when you've got double entry bookkeeping, this is one of the beauties of double entry, because if you try to show a transaction, you can only make 2 entries per line, and they must sum to 0. That's the conservation law that applies with double entry bookkeeping. So if you have 2 entries on the liability side, it doesn't create money. It just shuffles money from your account to my account when you buy my mobile phone off me. When you have the banks buying government bonds, that's shuffling reserves which are created by the deficits, and shuffling. The reserve assets go down, bond assets go up. So there's all on the asset side of the system. That doesn't create money either. That's why government borrowing, so-called, does not create money. It does not even borrow money. Okay, it's actually shuffling the funds in one account on the asset side of the banking sector to another account on the asset side of the banking sector. So there's no money involved in that at all, in that sense, let alone borrowing of money. So when you put it all together, you get you can see that it's the act of marking up both sides of the private banking sector's ledger that creates money. The banks can do it directly, because they can say, here's a loan and here's the money. You owe, we're going to make you a loan of $1 billion, and here's $1 billion to the cent. Okay. And then with the government, the way the government marks it up is that it makes a transfer from its account at the central bank, which is normally called something like the Consolidated Revenue Fund, CRF. The CRF goes down, the reserves go up. And what's going on in that is there's millions and billions of transactions on this front, where the government is saying, we're going to put money in Tyrone Keynes' account to give him some therapy to get rid of his addiction to nicotine, he's saying. Okay, and so there's part of the money
will do it.
Yeah, have a puff, mate. So part of oh my God, that's a puff. He disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Hey, it's not
like a magician.
It's not just, we just have Puff the Magic Dragon. That's more. That's my end over here. Sorry.
Nobody actually knew that wasn't a child's song. That was about smoking dope.
I know it was about dope. Puff the Magic Dragon.
Yeah.
We should actually put it in as a soundtrack at the end of this particular show. But yeah, so the government it's a transfer from the Consolidated Revenue Fund to the reserves. So that's the balance at the central bank level, and that's from one liability to another liability. And down, you look at the what it does at the private banking sector, it increases the reserve assets. Watch your balancing item. It also increases deposits, because those solid sums that are pumped through, which we just do at an aggregate level in a macro model, they're all absolutely earmarked for individuals. So maybe, Ty's just been enrolled in a compulsory get you off vaping program by the government. He gets the money to pay to go and see the therapist, who happens to be a 5'2". Let's just sort of, make it attractive here. So his deposit account goes up, and that balances the increase in reserves. So it's again the same thing. It's the double entry bookkeeping that creates it. When you go to the next level and look what happens at the Treasury, the Treasury's when it spends, and when it spends more than it taxes, the consolidated revenue fund goes down, and would actually go negative were it not for taxation inflows and bond sales. And then when you're balancing item at the Treasury, that decline in the asset is matched by a decline in the equity of the government. So the government necessarily goes into negative financial equity, and that creates positive financial equity for the non-government sector. So there's one prick in MMT, whom I won't mention by name, but people may guess who I'm talking about. And he had a go at me about one of my YouTube videos saying MMT is a lie, which was actually done by the marketing company. And I was horrified when I first saw it, and then I watched the video, and it had me explaining to Lex Friedman that MMT is accounting. So this is great. This works as clickbait. So I didn't delete it, left it there. Then this prick wrote to me and said, "What are you doing telling us MMT is a lie, Steve? We reckon we taught you everything you know about double entry bookkeeping. I'm pretty sure I've got the receipts. And by the way, it's quadruple book entry." I took great delight in telling him that his own specialty, which is talking about government money creation, not private, it's actually octuple. There are 8 entries to show government money creation. 2 on the Treasury's account, 2 on the central bank, 2 at the banking level, and 2 at the non-banking private sector. So you need 8 entries to show government money creation, but they all work in double entry bookkeeping, and all fundamentally are endogenous in the sense that the system as whole, which of course includes the government, creates the money. It's not something outside capitalism. It's essential to capitalism that money can be created. And neoclassicals haven't got a fucking clue about it.
And before you ask the next question, just quickly, Steve, what then would be the implications if people tomorrow all accepted that endogenous money happens, and this is the way that banks create money, and this is the way that the consolidated fund creates reserves? What are the implications of accepting that, so we can get beyond just information?
You'd stop running austerity.
Yeah,
you'd stop running austerity. That'd be the end of austerity, because they realise there's no point saving, trying to avoid the government going into debt, because that's how it creates money. If you want to have a fiat money system, the government has to go into negative financial equity. And that's what gives you positive financial equity in the non-government sector. And that is that fiat money creation is part of what we use in exchange to create goods and services. So it's a critically important part of a well-functioning capitalist economy, and the government should normally run a deficit to enable the money supply to grow when you have a growing economy. Now, the other side of it, and this is what's absolutely critical for me right now, and why I'm concerned about MMT making stuff-ups on some of its points, is that I expect the private monetary system to collapse when global warming really hits. And I don't mean if, I mean when. And when it happens, there'll be many, many people who can't pay their debt back because their farms will get wiped out. They can't get insurance. Their house gets destroyed. They can't get insurance. So many bank loans will fail. The banks will be rescued. I know what the pro-governments are like. They'll dive in and try to save their mates because the government's been dominated by the financial sector for the last 60, 70 years, basically. So they'll go back and rescue them again. But for the financial system to continue operating in the context of declining output, the only way that's going to be feasible is by fiat money creation, because there's no profit in creating money when the output is shrinking, as it will have to do, whether we do it voluntarily or by destroying productive capability. The output is going to fall. Okay? Now, in that situation, the only way you can maintain financial flows to keep people alive is through government money creation or through rationing. And I can actually see rationing coming in. as a result of this. We have to bloody well understand the system.
Deplorable. What's a lie about modern monetary theory? Like, really, are you just saying it? Like, trust me, I got my problems with MMT and some of the theories, but are you just saying this shit to get a kick in the chat? Like, is this your thing? You just spend 2 hours somewhere where you don't really want to be just to be a dick? Like, is that your life? Does it make you feel good about yourself? Are you going to say something like of insight in the comments instead of just making stupid ass statements? Like, say something with substance. What is wrong with MMT? And then we can have a discussion. I'm going to go on to the next question. And trust me, I'm not fully on board with a lot of the sideshow gimmicks in economics with a lot of different schools. But if you're going to raise an issue, raise it with some substance. It's just, but the internet is unbelievable. To our young 17-year-old friend, I would suggest you do become acquainted with math and engineering if you want to be a legitimate force in economics. However, to the second part of your question, you don't need those 3 letters to go achieve a job at the UN or anywhere you want, big banking institutions. I have multiple meetings every week with guys that just finished high school, and they're making like 6-digit figures in the finance industry, right? So you don't need to go and through the drivel of university. If that's something you want to do and like expand your horizons, go for it. But if you have a passion to go work at the UN or wherever, hard work will get you there. That's all you got to do. Hard work.
But also, you can do like I've got friends who work in the United Nations who are lawyers, for example. So there's lots and lots of drafting of laws when you work in the United Nations. You can do a law degree. If your ambition is to work in somewhere like the World Bank or the United Nations, and you don't want to do the mathematics, then you can still do the legal side of things. That's another potential career path.
What else do we got here? Oh, here's a good one. Your thoughts on Georgism. Dr. Keene, your thoughts.
To be honest, I've not read Henry George. I've read some Henry George, small amounts of his literature, and I actually am good friends with a number of Georges back in Australia. And when they explained what their theories were, it was basically Ricardo's theory of rent. So, and that's one reason I didn't think, if that's all George is working on, that I don't need to read that particular book yet. And it's been so long that so many other bloody things to attack. I haven't had a chance to go and take a good look at George on that front. I find Georgists tend to come down and say, everything can be remedied by using a land tax. So increasing land value, that source of taxation. You don't have to worry about taxing workers anymore. And like as an alternative tax system, certainly given the impact of income tax on people's political attitudes, income tax tends to turn people right wing. Okay, shot saying it's not Henry George. That's how it expanded to me by Georgists in Sydney. So I do need to read George at some stage. That's a deficiency in my research. But when I'm too busy taking on Nordhaus over criminally bad research, which I think is going to destroy capitalism. That's my next book. Title is How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism. In that world, I've got to live Henry George less status still. So when are these? If I finish writing the next 3 books I want to finish, including the final edition of Debunking Economics, and if I ever get a chance, a genuine magnum opus where I bring together everything into one book, then I might get a chance to read George after that. But at the moment, that's one of the weaknesses in my knowledge.
Doesn't it become so? You tax land value for a while.
Yeah.
Doesn't it depress it enough to not be effective? I mean,
well, this is one of the things about it. Like I'm having seen how my ideas on housing in Australia were used to fuck up the economy and avoid a crisis by doubling and trebling the grants they gave to first-home buyers. I'm aware of how politicians will use good advice. Okay, they'll use good advice to keep themselves in power. Okay? They won't use good advice to manage well. So, if one of my fears is if you made government revenue in terms of tax revenue. Of course, I know it's not funding government spending, but if you made that based on increasing land values, then frankly, politicians would increase land values. Okay. They'd see a way that increasing land values are actually part of the revenue stream, the taxation stream, and they'd probably end up promoting it, particularly if you had local councils getting the money from taxation. Of course, they can't create money, so therefore the higher the rate of increase in land values, the better off the councils get to be. And ironically, that's part of the reason why China's succeeded in its industrialization programs, because a huge part of Chinese industrialization is actually local mayors, and we're talking mayors of cities twice the size of New York and Los Angeles, selling land parcels on the outskirts of their local government area to property developers, and therefore getting money from the property developers and using that to finance investment in a range of industrial ventures. So in that sense, partially, the Chinese growth in Chinese industrial capability has been financed by land bubbles. And of course, in that situation, they want land values to keep on rising. So one way you can make land values rise is allow private banks to lend large amounts of money for people to buy houses using mortgages. That sets off the whole bubble. So there are sick elements to the way that has been worked out. He's also right to say China succeeded by coal. That's Entropy Juggler's current comment. So managing energy properly has been a major part of Chinese success as well. But part of the finances that have enabled industrialization have been generated by a private debt bubble the government itself encouraged when you had the global financial crisis in 2007. As it happens, Chinese exports fell 46% when that crisis hit. So the Chinese Communist Party's decision to boost the economy was basically tell the banks to lend to anybody with a pulse. And because the banks are very much government dominated in China, they basically went out and, anybody who wasn't dead got a loan to build a house or buy a house, and you had a huge property bubble taking off. So that is my part of my fear about saying a land tax will do it is that two things. It still thinks the government funds itself by taxation when it doesn't. It funds itself by creating money. So it's partly plays into that mythology. But it also, in the hands of politicians, if there was a way in which their revenue was determined by rising land values, they'd make sure land values rose. So I have my difficulties with that part of Georgism.
Is there an argument that LVTs could work though because assuming they're not revenue, that they would work like a sin tax, like on tobacco or something, in order to depress or make it not desirable to own lots of property? That might still work, right?
It might still work. I mean, for example, you've got Gary Stevenson talking about a wealth tax. Now,
okay. Sorry, but we got to keep going. People are getting mad. It seems like your conversation is selective. There's so many there's so many coming in. It's not if I've missed yours. It's not because I'm playing favoritism. I'm trying to string the conversation along. Steve has got a wealth of knowledge that is if I could put it in a book, it would stretch to my ceiling. So when he goes off, he goes off. He will go.
Metaphor. It's been buried like an Iranian underground centrifuge. That's beautiful.
If I've missed your question, it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's just I've got people like deplorable and shit saying shit things about MMT, and it just drives me nuts, right? Because they're so uninsightful. So I apologize if I've missed your question.
Tony got a good answer there. Tony says there'll be 50 questions a week and time to answer a dozen. So
so I apologize. If I see your question, Tax, I will highlight it and I'll give you priority. I do apologize. We do have another question here, and here's an insightful way to put this. A little better. It's asking a question. It's obviously a bit anti-Keynesianism, anti-MMT, but it's a legitimate question. Hello. When governments are known to be totally non-productive in an economic sense, are they allowed to grow to an unimaginable size and become so massive on drain they drain their host economies. I butchered reading that completely.
Oh,
Steve,
you didn't call him a queen, but
I didn't call him a queen, but the first falsehood is government spend on productive things. I've never seen even the biggest socialist government. They have an agenda and they spend on productive things that employs people, right? It is productive, right? There are inefficiencies in government spending, but I've never seen in the history of this planet, we'll go right back to Rome, where governments, spend on non-productive things and that's all they do. But Steve, I want you to answer it in a nice, calm way where I'm not getting mad at the question. Steve.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the 19th century, because if you want to have the golden age of Austrian capitalism, or the Austrian belief when they have a golden age, it'd be the 1800s, particularly in America, because at that stage, the total size of government as a percentage of GDP was about 3%. Okay, and basically it covered the military, the police, whatever police system America had, and that was about it. There was very little. There was no unemployment benefits. There was no income tax. It was all taxation of imports, and in that case, the importers actually paying the tax to be able to come and sell in the country. So that's your ideal capitalist small government world. And what it had was a financial crash about every 10 to 15 years, with the biggest and the worst being the Great Depression. But you also had the second, probably the biggest actually, it's hard to get the proper data on it these days. The biggest crash was what's called the Panic of 1837. And that occurred because the government managed to pay its debt down to zero. Now, what that meant was the private sector went on a speculative bubble, borrowing money to gamble on rising asset prices, I presume land at the time. And that when that bubble of rising credit turned negative, you had the biggest period of negative credit in the history of capitalism and a devastating crash. So then it comes along the Great Depression. Again, the governments are much the same size, and not quite as small as 3%, but maybe 5% of GDP. You have a President, Calvin Coolidge, who tries to reduce government debt by 1% of GDP every year and succeeds, thinks that's going to cause the system to stabilize. In fact, you had the Great Depression. Now, what's going on there is the government spending is effectively, if you think in terms of an air conditioning system, it's a homeostatic stabilizer. When private activity turns down, government activity goes up. Less tax revenue comes in, more unemployment benefits are paid, and that actually prevents us falling into a debt deflation. So the fundamental role that I see government playing in a capitalist economy, in the modeling sense that I do in terms of how does the macroeconomy function, is that large government spending stops you falling into a debt deflation. Now, when you get rid of it, you'll go back to the 19th century, where every 10 to 15 years, there's a serious economic and financial crisis. And the worst ones in the history of capitalism almost led to socialism, both times. Okay, so if you want to avoid socialism, back the mixed economy. If you get rid of the mixed economy, you'll fall back into a world in which there are serious crises that leads to workers saying there's got to be a better way to organise production, and they'll start joining the Communist Party, and it's running for the overthrow of capitalism. So the mixed economy is part of your guarantee that that doesn't happen.
If I had enough money, I'd hire the space in Leicester Square and just put on it that graph that you've shown us a couple of times with the mixed economy after the Great Depression, with the inflation versus deflation, and before that, when there were just these massive swings of 30% every few years. It just looks horrific, and people don't realize.
And when you had that falling prices, it was all in the context of falling economic activity. One amplified the other. This is what Fisher argued when he developed the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. If you have too much private debt and too much deflation, one amplifies the other, and you basically go down a deep hole from which there is no necessary escape. It tends to be government spending that gets you out of it, even in situations like the 19th century. So the Civil War actually revived the American economy in that sense, because they had to produce money for the war, and that it was part of what caused stimulus for the economy as a whole. So be careful what you wish for. Oh, that's one of yours, Ty. Better take a look at it on the big screen.
Yeah, so I'll just try to make this a little bit larger. This is a question: what's the fastest way to understand money creation? Well, Steve's been saying it for the last hour and 24 minutes. Use Ravel, and this is my large national model. And if you look at line 3 on the side, you'll see firm net credit. And what's really happening when let's say you or a firm goes and gets a loan is your bank account. I guess I'll go to the screen. Your bank account. Um, Oh, this is from the bank's perspective. So, from the
Yeah.
bank's perspective, they have an asset account, and this is firm loans, right? And so that is increased when the act of giving the loan, and then on their liability side, they hold deposit accounts for firms, and that goes up. And the exact reverse happens when the loan is paid off. You have elastic money then. Obviously, the bank's not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're looking to earn interest, and of course, they'll earn interest, and their equity account goes up. And you with Minsky, you can map all this out. I'm looking for a smaller. Oh, it's
What's
waiting.
up?
There we
Okay.
go. There we go. Here's a smaller version, right? So if there's interest payments, your household deposit account goes down and your equity goes down. Vice versa, the bank's equity will go up. So what I'm not trying to educate anybody with this model, but what I'm saying is you can use Minsky to develop your own understanding or listen to somebody else's theory and build it out in your godly tables. And that's the best way to learn how money creation works, both for fiat money, which is government created money. So there's a convoluted process in the United States how that's done, but you can break it down quite easily if you're using a set of godly tables to kind of map that out. And then once you've got your stock flow, consistent modeling, so you know where the money's going, it's not just disappearing into the clouds. There's liability swaps, there's asset swaps, right? Then you can model some like dynamics behind it. You can run your system, and next thing you know, you've got a predictive model of U.S. economy, for instance, right? So I really encourage everybody to download the Ravel software. Steve, you can find the Ravel software. Is it patreon.com/slash Ravelation?
Ravelation, RAV, not REV, so Ravelation. And the price is, if you want to do just the modeling that Ty's showing here, that'll cost you the princely sum of $2 a month. And if you want to do the empirical analysis as well, that'll cost you $10 a month. But we thought we'd make money out of Ravel for the data analysis. We're still attempting to do that. But I think the most vital thing that Ravel can do, as you say, is get people to understand money, because the level of stupidity and lack of understanding of money is just overwhelming. And it stymies everything. At least it's bad government policy and insane ideas about private banking, which are completely unrealistic, and therefore we get too much private debt and not enough government spending. It's just insane how it's debilitated us. We have to get rid of it. And as you say, but I might actually share my screen for a second, if that's okay, because I've got a much simpler model than you've got there. So
Well,
I'll just
hold on. I've just boosted government spending by 200%. I'm trying to get some inflation happening, but it's not
okay,
working.
yeah.
It's not working out. So I don't know what's going on there. So either my model's wrong or neoclassical economics is wrong. But
Oh, it couldn't be the latter. The neoclassicals must be right. It's such a religion. Yeah, I know.
bring up your model, Steve.
Okay, mate. This is just a much simpler model than Ty's, and more visual. That's going to be us in the way there at the moment. But can you see the banks
Hold on.
table now?
Hold on, let me bring it up here. Let me
Yep.
bring it up and let me make it big, full screen. Let me take away the chat too here, guys. Take
Okay.
this away. Let me take away the ticker too so we can see absolutely everything. Steve, there you go.
Okay. So what you've got here is very, very simple model, not anywhere near as complicated as Ty's simulation model, but you have banks having reserves, banks lending to firms, and banks buying government bonds. I show there as debt of the government because I built this model working from the neoclassical myth of loanable funds and changed it very rapidly to be the real world of bank originated money and debt. What you see in terms of deposit accounts, I've got basically firms and households, that's it, in the private sector, and therefore firms pay wages to households. And what you've got is a minus wages and a plus wages on the liability side of the banking system's ledger. So no money is created. That dog must be neoclassical. Okay, and then consumption, the same story. Household accounts fall, firms' accounts go up. All the other operations there create money because when firms borrow, the debt of the debt they owe to the banking sector goes up. The amount of money they've got goes up. That creates money. Interest payments by firms does not create money. That transfers money from the firm sector to the bank's equity. But then you look at taxation. Taxation of this very simple model I'm showing, taxes being levied just on households. Tax reduces the amount of money in households' bank accounts, and it reduces reserves. Spending increases reserves and increases the amount of money in bank accounts. Next operation also doesn't create money because when bonds are purchased, they're purchased using reserves. So reserves go down, bonds go up, no money creation. And that's one reason we get so irritated when people say the government is borrowing. It's not borrowing. It's converting reserves that it created through government spending into bonds that it creates as well. And it could leave them out completely and still create money. Interest on bonds creates money because reserves go up. And that's how the money turns up in the bank's equity. And they finally have got bank spending that reduces the bank's equity, increases its liabilities, also does not create money. So that's the sort of vision you have. And then what Ravel lets you do is cascade that out through all the other entities in the system, so you can see it from their point of view. So all those operations there determine what happens with reserves. See the reserves operation minus tax, plus spend, minus bonds, plus interest. That comes down over here. You have reserves reduced by bond purchases, increased by government interest on bonds, increased by government spending, reduced by taxation. That's the balancing entry there. When you take a look at what that means at the Treasury level, it means the Treasury, its only asset is its financial asset, is its consolidated revenue fund. Bonds increase the amount there, interest reduces it, spending reduces it, tax increases it. What's the balancing item? They all occur on the equity side. The bonds are increase the government's assets and liabilities. So that's a bit like the same operation for converting reserves to bonds for the that increases assets and liabilities at the same time, so no effect on the government's net equity. But the government fundamentally creates positive equity for the private sector by creating negative equity for itself. That's how a government creates money, by going into negative equity, and that creates positive equity. So I've got the interest paid on the government goes to the banking sector, so the banks get positive equity out of interest payments. Spending, in this case, spending goes to the firm sector, so that increases the equity of the firm sector. And taxation, which is a positive for the Treasury equity, is a negative for households. So you can see the overall pattern there. And then what you can do in a very simple model like this is simulate it and see what happens when you change various things. So in this case, I've got the government spending 31% of GDP and taxing 30%. So it's running a 1% of GDP deficit. And what that does is it increases both the amount of money in circulation and the amount of debt. So the debt to GDP ratio will stabilize. You don't get the crisis that neoclassicals think is going to happen because they think the government borrows from the private sector. It does not. It creates money for them. So let's just stop that sharing there. I'll stop them off.
As the non-economist, there is the outsider. The thing that I see, though, is how people experience money in their own, apart from obviously within this chat and everybody listening in, they've got enough knowledge to find this interesting. But of course, the common experience is that it comes from a finite pot of money. It's a culturally very hard thing to break through that.
It is.
And this level of analysis is excellent because, of course, you could you could introduce it at the people who are influencing policy level. Great. But culturally, man, people do not want to see it this way. They really don't.
They don't, yeah. And if you think something has to come from somewhere else. So like the whole loanable funds is the loan comes out of a bucket and we transfer it to another bucket. And so one bucket goes down, the other goes up. Okay? And that's the vision. It comes out of somewhere. The difference with endogenous money, back to the question way back, is that it isn't a transfer from one place to another. It's an increase in two levels. Okay? So you can get a loan by transferring money out of one person's account into another. That doesn't change the amount of money in existence. And that's what building societies are like. You can get a loan by the bank saying, here's $1 million. And by the way, you owe us $1 million. They both go up. And that's the effect. It's not that it comes out of nothing, which is the shorthand people use. It's created by a process which creates both loans and money at the same time.
So,
sorry.
That's okay. I lost his question. So Ryan, I don't know where it is, but Ryan is saying he understands the theory and he believes in it. He just doesn't understand the implications. And Ryan, I would suggest a real cool tool is the Federal Reserve database. It's called fred.com. And one thing you could look at is what's called the Capital Utilization Index. It's a rate. And so there's a school of thought that a simplified school of thought that government spending it decreases investment because we're at maximum capital utilization. But if you look at the US data, between 1950 and now, it's been between 75 and 80% capital utilization rate. So that means the economy always has the ability to have government intervention, right, to employ idle resources. So employing capital plants that are sitting somewhat idle will, of course, employ more workers. And this was back to Keynes' ideas. He didn't suggest that you spend through a boom. He suggested that you spend during the slump and then reduce your spending when there's boom times. And there's the hot argument that also that idle resources are idle because individual capitalists don't want to use it during that specific time period. And some of that might be true to a degree, but Keynes said a great bulk of it is just sitting there and can be employed through government inducing demand through government spending. So it's never been the case in the 20th century or the 21st century that the economy didn't have the ability to absorb additional government spending to employ resources and to employ people. Now, obviously, this is where all the trolls in the chats, MMT says print to the hills. MMT doesn't say that. Keynesian doesn't say that. Obviously, there is a limit to just flooding the economy with money. Obviously, that's inflationary. But, some practical implications is you can have government spending without implication on inflation because there are idle resources, and the data shows that. So utilize the Fred database because there's a wealth of information there. And also, I've done a ton of statistical analysis on money printing and correlating to inflation, and there's none. So think about it this way. Money can become inflationary if it's moving faster than the real goods and services in the economy, but just at the act of creating more money. And if it's just sitting in a balance, it might push up some asset prices for rich people. It's not really the inflationary thing that the neoclassical and mainstream textbooks claim that it is. So you really got to look and understand that our capitalist systems are never at 100% capital utilization, right? There may be an exception. If I looked at the data maybe during World War II, where we were employing all the resources we could for the Allies to win that battle, so we were converting private industries into war industries, there's an argument there that we could have been at 100% capacity. And this is why Steve will say why we had war bonds was to reduce the demand for private services. It wasn't to fund the war, it just reduced the demand in the private sector. So private citizens would buy a bond, they wouldn't be buying sugar or metals to put on their roof, right? And that would go to the war effort, right? So there's so much nuanced information out there. And another thing too, guys, is MMT understands, and I got my problems with MMT in some areas, but they completely understand that it's a resource issue that lies underneath the funding issue, right? So they are explicitly saying the nominal funding issue isn't the issue. It's the real resources and the distribution and the employment of them that really counts underneath. And they explicitly say that. There should be more written about it, and there's not. And I think more people are coming along and they'll do that. But these are some of the myths we want to dispel as well. And I don't know if I picked any more questions. Dave?
I think a good thought experiment for that is just simply you could print a gazillion dollars. You put it in a vault somewhere, it's not going to do anything. It's exactly where and how you spend that gazillion will cause inflation or not, depending. You know, if you spend it on, I don't know, buying a high-speed rail system for your company, of your country, you're going to put a whole lot of resources into it. I don't know if that will automatically cause inflation, but it will certainly cause inflation in the areas, you know, around high-speed rail.
What you tend to see, again, when you look at the data, and this is where you've got to have data as well as theories, is that the empirical relationship seems to be that money doesn't create inflation, it accommodates inflation. This is the argument that Basel put back in 1979 in the endogenous money supply, and then he did the statistical work in 1982 to back it up. And what you find is that in this, you'll see this being argued by Isabella Weber and by Blair Fix, who are two of the best empirical non-neoclassical economists out there. And what they find is that it struggles over the distribution of income that leads to increase in prices, and the increase in prices is then accommodated by the monetary system. So the classic one that applied in the 1970s, this is where the inflation came from, is that when Israel won the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, for 40 or 50 years before that, the seven sisters, the oil majors that dominated, the American and English and Dutch corporations that dominated oil production in the most of the world, especially the Arabian Peninsula, they paid $2.50 a barrel. That was the price they paid, and that's all they ever got out of it. And then when the war was lost, OPEC had already been formed, and OPEC put an embargo against any country that had supported Israel in the war, which of course included America. So the oil price went from $2.50 a barrel to $10. Okay? Now, what that meant was, if you wanted to reuse oil, you had to pay more money for it. So the firms simply accessed what are called lines of credit. And the lines of credit are like credit cards for larger organizations. If you don't access them, there's no money created. But if you do access them, you create money, and there's nothing the banks can stop you, because they've signed a contract saying you have like $1 trillion or $1 billion of borrowing capacity. So anybody who wanted to pay those higher prices simply increased their debt to the banks, and that therefore increased the money supply. Then the workers who found themselves facing higher prices for oil, and there was a very high level of employment in 1973, 74, their response was to demand wage rises through their trade unions, which did exist at the time. So you had an increase in wages, which were also paid out of the lines of credit of the companies, which expanded the money supply. So it's not that increasing the money supply causes inflation. The general rule can be reversed under extreme circumstances like COVID and so on, is that price changes cause change in the money supply. And that's even been discovered by bloody neoclassicals, but they never integrated into their thought. So there's a classic paper called Real Facts in a Monetary Myth about business cycle data, done by two of the most conservative neoclassicals on the planet. And they said that the results they got were interesting because it contradicted their theories. Did they change their theories?
Heaven forbid.
Oh, God, no, can't do that. Yeah. They're handed down by Marshall, therefore they must be true. This is the scientific nature of economic theory. They all go back and try to defend the great books rather than looking at the data and seeing, can we actually explain the world, which they can't do.
I wonder, apart from it not being able to afford a change in career, it's also a question of, there's that worldview that they've bought into, that they basically become heretics to their own, idols.
Absolutely.
I think it's intellectually very hard for people to just switch anyway.
That's the huge issue. Most of them can't do it, So, and this is exactly, it's a religious conversion.
I think it's at that level.
If you're a neoclassical and you suddenly admit and absorb the fact that banks create money, or that firms have excess capacity, or that marginal cost doesn't rise, and numerous other real elements that contradict the theory, you walk away from it. So my favorite example of that was Alan Blinder, who was deputy. He was the deputy governor of the Federal Reserve, vice president of the American Economic Association. You can't get much higher rank than that in terms of the economic pecking order. He did a survey into costs of firms to try to justify new Keynesian so-called models over new classical so-called models by neoclassicals. And what he found was that the vast majority of firms reported constant or falling marginal cost. He said this is the absolutely. I thought, what he forgot. He said the overwhelmingly bad news here, brackets for economic theory, is that the vast majority of firms report constant or falling marginal cost, and also have much higher fixed costs than fit up in the theory. Now that shocked him. Okay. And he said so in the book. You then read his textbook. What does he teach? Rising marginal cost and trivial fixed costs. He basically forgot what he learned himself to hang on to the religion. And that's what most of them haven't got the courage to break away from the defining faith of their lives. So they remain religious till they die.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of precedents for that. Look, you've compared it to religion. I think there's plenty of religious people who are like, well, I like the community that I'm in. I don't believe this stuff anymore, but hey, they all do nice things.
That's one reason I love the show Lucifer. Have you watched Lucifer?
No. What's that one?
It's a good laugh. Okay, it's on Netflix. The devil decides to take a vacation.
Is it John Hamm, the guy from Mad Men, I think?
Tom, somebody, bloody good actor, brilliant actor. But he's the devil, and he's completely honest. So he tells people he's the devil, and they won't believe him. Okay, because it just goes against their worldview. We've given up on religion. Nobody believes in heaven and hell these days. And suddenly you find they're real, and here's the bloke who runs hell sitting right in front of you. And people's reaction, they simply cannot comprehend. They will not absorb the fictional fact that he actually is the devil, even when he proves it to them sometimes. And it's a very funny show. I love it. It's one of my little relaxation things to watch the show. It's so well written and well acted. But yeah, the lovely point is he is the devil. He says he's the devil, and nobody listens to him because that can't be true. Well, in this fictional world, it is. So the same thing for neoclassicals. You can tell them that banks create money. You can show that firms have excess capacity. They can find out that marginal cost is constant, and they walk past it like a horse with blinkers.
Well, I think this is always the limit with an intellectual approach to this. Yeah. You've got the information, it's there, and then it's how to, punters like me, well, not just me, hopefully, but that are storytellers can somehow help to tell these stories as well. And you need a lot of people to do that. Basically, it's a cultural change, and I constantly wonder how to make that more accessible, because I can see what you're saying about it, and I can't see how to get even people I know to talk about it, and that's important. But
I started writing a book for Rachel Reeves, and not for her, against her. I wrote one for Elon Musk and against Rachel Reeves. And then when bloody Musk became part of the political scene in the States, I stopped working on that one and wrote one for him. Now he's been kicked out by Trump and they're falling out. So I've got this unfinished book, which is really a cat sat on the mat, how to use Ravel and the godly tables to prove the situation to your friends. So I will ultimately finish that bloody thing. But the idea is to say, look, if you accept that, you understand the government spending creates money, you understand the banking system, you want to get to your friends, this is vital. Bore the shit out of them at the pub, okay? Get them to come up with their views at the pub, lay the tables out, make sure they don't put too much wine on top of your laptop or whatever else when you show it, but fucking prove it to them, because in some ways the survival of civilization depends upon people getting over these myths.
Let's do our last two questions here. They've kind of been in queue. Here's a one. I don't know if you can answer. What are the theoretical and practical implications of the land of barter being a complete myth? Steve, your thoughts?
That's a brilliant question, because what it means is suddenly money matters. Money, you cannot analyze capitalism without looking at the role of money. Okay? So money is a fundamental part of a capitalist economy. And one thing I had to do in terms of arguing all this, by the way, is even my fellow post-Keynesians couldn't, even though they knew money was endogenous, they couldn't work out how that had an impact on the macroeconomy. So I won't say who, and this is a much nicer person than the person I was making negative comments about a short while ago from MMT, much nicer member of the post-Keynesian community. When I once asked him, how do people pay for the houses that we were looking at from his backyard, he said, out of their savings. So even post-Keynesians can't necessarily get their heads around that money has an impact on the macroeconomy, even though they know the bank's endogenously created. And I think a lot of this reason comes out of the fact that most post-Keynesians still work in discrete time difference equations, and they therefore can't see the flow dynamics that you see when you work in continuous time, whereas that's been second nature to me throughout my life. So what I did to prove that money has genuine macroeconomic impacts was to develop what I call the Moore table, in honor of the great Basil Moore, great economist, great person as well. And so what that had was the flows involved in a monetary economy. So if you model loanable funds, what goes on in loanable funds is that we divide the house sector economy into three sectors: household, services, manufacturing. Imagine the service sector lending to the household sector. That's a transfer of money. It's not a purchase. So it goes diagonally across this table, and then people pay interest in the other direction, and they use the money they've borrowed to buy manufacturing goods. You do the mathematics on that, and you find that the change in debt, which is credit, has no role in aggregate demand. That's loanable funds. When you then say we've got, in fact, banks create money, then the money that's borrowed by somebody from a bank adds to the liability of the banking sector. The double entry part for the debt itself adds to the asset side. So you have the amount of money in the household sector goes up from borrowing it. They then spend it on the manufacturing sector. You do the mathematics, and if you find credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. So once you've got that, you cannot ignore money. It's fundamentally part of aggregate demand and income. It's part of asset markets dynamics as well. And because credit can be positive or negative, it's by far the most volatile part of aggregate demand and income. So when you look at the mathematics, the statistics, you find that overwhelmingly credit is what drives economic cycles. And that's when you get rid of the land of barter, credit matters. And that's probably the most important discovery from endogenous money theory.
Final question from the minstrel. Does Ravel commensurate resource flows mobilized by money creation? Steve?
Yeah, well, you've just got to, it's a modeling tool. It's not a model, okay? So if you build a monetary model, you can then tie that to a model of physical resources as well, which both Ty and I have done more times than we care to count. So you do the monetary transactions using a Godley table, you give the physical flows using a circuit diagram, and the physical flows will also involve depleting natural resources. So you're using energy as an input, you're therefore depleting your energy resources. You're generating waste because production, according to the second law of thermodynamics, necessarily generates more waste than it does order. So you've got that tied in there as well. All these things are quite feasible and quite doable. And one of the reasons I get pissed off when Turkey's MMT, those zealots on Twitter, have a go at me about my models, not including production. You don't want to see the production models unless you're an engineer and you can read differential equations. They're going to wipe you out. So yes, it's quite easy to do that, and it's an integrated modeling system, not just monetary, but any other flows. Ty on that front does a far better job than I do, in the sense that he always imposes the units on various sections. So money is in units of dollars. Money flows in dollars per year. Physical flows are in terms of widgets or kilograms of kilograms of objects. That those units, you have all the unit conversions that go on between one and the other, an essential part of understanding a capitalist economy. And Ravel is more than capable of being able to model that, as well as the monetary dynamics.
Yeah. So there's two parts to what Steve and I do. So we do the MMT stock flow consistent thing. Rest his soul when godly. I consider. Well, maybe he's not. Steve, were there people before godly that heavily use stock flow modeling? Like where?
No. Oh,
No.
you do. I mean, people like Goodwin, for example. So Richard Goodwin was, if you had to pick out an economist who was the first person to really do genuine mathematical modeling using effectively stock flow consistency, then it's Richard Goodwin. But Goodwin was a damn good mathematician. So he worked in continuous time. Unfortunately, Wynne worked in discrete time most of the time, but he was also quite capable of learning the continuous time modeling. And Wynne built his own. So he actually commissioned it by Francis Cripps. So he had his own modeling system, which involved double entry bookkeeping as well. So in terms of doing a technical framework for building models like I now do in Ravel, Wynne was actually, yes, definitely the first person to do it. So he's the genuine pioneer of stock flow consistent modeling.
Yes. So we do the stock flow consistent. Like, okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I'll explain, what it is to me. Stock flow consistent modeling allows me to track the system itself. It gives me the system state. So if I'm designing a system, and it doesn't even have to be economics, it can be any system, some resource, I don't know, factory system, whatever. I guess that's microeconomics. I kind of start from stocks and flows, because your system states are the foundation of your model. All your dynamics come from your system states interacting and changing with each other. You don't have stocks, you don't have a system dynamic model, right? The flows are kind of secondary, right? You can't have flows without stocks and system dynamics. But anyways, I use that kind of like as my scaffolding. So in Minsky, or Ravel, it's called Ravel now, sorry Steve, the Minsky portion of Ravel, which is the system dynamic program, I'll build out my godly tables, because then it establishes my flows and my stocks, right? And then I'll go into using functions to create dynamics. So one thing could be Steve's how he postulates that, and which I've proved, by the way, statistically, that in aggregate, profits are the main driver of capital investment. Like it works perfectly if you use the actual data, right? And so that's when you start to postulate shapes of your functions, right? And then you can pull down your flows and connect, okay, what flow is that function affecting? And of course, then you've got to build like ratios. So your ratios in system dynamics are your behavioral inputs, right? And then out of your function, you get multipliers, and you multiply that, you postulate, okay, what does that multiplier affect? And you multiply it against something, and you'll get your flow. That flow goes into the stock, that stock changes, and that stock also has influences on other flows to other stocks, and you get nonlinear dynamics. But Steve and I go beyond just accounting. We go into dynamic modeling, continuous time modeling, and that's where you get your emergent behaviors. And this is one of the areas where I am critical of MMT kind of stalling, right? And if anything, I see people like Bill Mitchell use. Did Dave disappear on us?
I may have a dropout from these systems. He'll come back in. But he's in London, a third world country.
Third world country, right?
I'm not joking on that front. The internet is far worse in there than it is in Netherlands, where it's quite reliable and fast.
So where MMT might fall short is that continuous time modeling. We have Warren Mosler's revolution is that he really showed that the government creates the money before it can be taxed, and hopefully he goes down in history. There he is. Let me bring him back on here. Hopefully he goes down in history establishing that fact, and that's great. Now, where he's wrong is in trade. It's the most bizarre comparative advantage neoclassical argument I have ever heard in my life. But what could help with things in the area of trade, which I've modeled, is dynamic systems. So you can see the emergent behaviors that come out of the system. It's easy to say in isolation, if you give a piece of paper, you get some junk in return, but dynamically, there's a whole other story, right? So that's the difference. Like Steve and I aren't just doing static accounting definitions, right? We're actually employing dynamic equations behind it, right? To see how they interact when they change based on some assumptions that we make, that we look at the data and confirm, okay, well, that is a true function. Now, if I'm going to apply that into the model and I'm going to see how it behaves throughout time, and then we get these emergent properties. Steve's big famous claim to fame is the financial crisis of 2008. He showed a diminishing cycle in the business cycle with employment, inflation, and the great moderation, what we saw going through the 90s and the 2000s, and that ultimately broke down. And so that you can only find that sort of stuff by modeling it dynamically, right? The only other way to get to things like 2008, where you got the gold bug guy that you could say predicted it too, is verbally predicted. And Austrian economics likes to do that again, but you've got no methodology there and you can't confirm it. And so that's what Steve and we go beyond just stock flow. We're into dynamics too. Dave, are you okay? We were worried third world country and all. You lost your internet connection.
Too. I was just like,
yeah, you thought maybe been flooded away. Static. Maybe there was a whole flood of shit that came through your house from the local river.
From the local river. On that note, I mean, that's a really nice way to finish, isn't it?
Oh, shit, yeah.
Okay.
I'm still good.
Okay, so we're done?
We are done. Make sure everybody, there is that post on Steve Keen's community post channel. If you got some suggestions for our live streams, how to make them better without being a troll, because I won't read those ones. We'll think about it, right? And so we might have guests come back, and then Dave can be a real host because he's a lot better than me. Or we'll do Q&As one week, guests another week. Who knows? But give your ideas, because there's about 200 people that come here week after week after week, right? And we'd like to grow that, right, more. But we want to hear from our regular viewers what they like and what they don't like. Maybe my hair sucks. I don't know. Maybe I swear too much. I don't know.
Fuck no.
Maybe. Yeah. Who knows? But anyways, until next week.
It's been good to be back.
Yeah.
So, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Yep. Good to be around. Okay.
And good to see some regular names in the chat as well. Really good. So, yeah, nice to be back. And see you again soon.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.